everyone, welcome to the Iterative Podcast. Today we have Yolanda Lee, co-founder of Uncommon. Uncommon is a private leadership network for the next generation of female leaders in Asia. Uncommon provides a strong and uplifting network, a personalized development roadmap, tailored courses and workshops, and an enriching speaker series, all in one membership. Talk about the road less traveled. At 20, Yolanda rented an abandoned industrial warehouse in her hometown of Toronto and got artists like Daft and Major Lazer to play there by messaging them on Myspace. She went on to intern at the European Court for Human Rights, graduated top of her class at Oxford, and worked for Uber and Rocket Internet in Africa. We talk about what drove her to these different paths and how those experiences shaped her. Towards the end of our conversation, she opens up about her motivation for starting Uncommon, what her personal experience has been in male-dominated industries, why Uncommon is so important, and what we, especially men, can do to help. It's an important conversation that I hope you stay and listen to. Here's my conversation with Yolanda Lee from Uncommon. Hi, Yolanda. Thanks for being on here today.
Hi, thanks for having me, Sukan.
So I always like to start these with kind of like origin stories. It turns out not only superheroes have origin stories. So maybe you could start with kind of where you grew up and where you were born.
Cool. So I am from Canada. I was born in the suburbs of Toronto, in a place called Scarborough that has a pretty bad rep, but I remember it being like pretty boring and cookie cutter. My parents...
Bad rep in like what sense?
Bad rep in like, it's kind of not a nice part of town. It's like, okay. I mean, there's nice parts of it and less nice parts of it, but it kind of has like, I guess it's not like a posh part of Toronto by any means. I guess it's a place where a lot of like people who have come from, there's actually a large like Caribbean community there. That's where my parents were immigrants from Trinidad and Tobago, and I think they had their families had kind of settled in this area when they moved to Canada.
Do you know what the story is of like why people from that part of the world ended up in that part of Toronto?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily in that part of Toronto, but I know that, in the late 60s, early 70s, there was pretty much open immigration to Canada, but in that, I guess it's sort of like one person moved there. It was cheaper than living central, and then it's like one person moves in, and they're like, oh, I know a guy, and then they
I feel like all immigrant communities, like all immigrant communities, like I got an uncle who moved to this place.
Yeah,
we should go.
Yeah, exactly, and it's like, but then so that's sort of where I was born, and then when I was about 7 years old, I was accepted to a little private school in the city that I'd been on the wait list since I was like in the womb. My mom was like very focused on giving us a really good education. And when I got accepted, we moved to the city. So to downtown Toronto, to an area called the Annex, which is a relatively affluent area. My parents bought like a fixer-upper home, and we moved there. And we were the first, and to my knowledge, the last ethnic minority family to buy a house there. My dad once got like arrested taking a barbecue from our house, which was at number 171, to our school at number 45, to a school function. So it was like a super, super like white neighborhood.
So I feel like, I mean, some people will probably watch this on the video and they will kind of like they can infer what your ethnicity is. But like, I guess for the like podcast listeners, like, do you want to just kind of like talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I am Trinidadian, but so ethnically, Trinidad is a pretty diverse place. So my family's like ethnic origins are Indian, Chinese, West African, and a little bit of Caucasian as well. So we're kind of a mixed bag.
So what was it like when you kind of moved into that like all white neighborhood? I guess it was more diverse where you were from. There's like more people like you, and then you moved into this like all white neighborhood. It's like nobody like you.
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, like I was always in like Montessori schools, or my parents always had me in like other schools. So I was always like, for as long as I can remember, I don't think I necessarily always had the awareness, but I can always remember being like the only brown kid in the school. And but moving into that neighborhood, I think when you're that young, like you're just so adaptive. Like I had moved schools quite a lot because my mom was like very demanding of my educators. And so we would just, I think like for my early life, we would just kind of move schools super often. So I was like very adaptive. And I don't think I realized it until I became a little bit older that, oh, I'm like actually the only person of color here. Yeah.
So, and what kind of kid were you growing up?
Um, so building upon like I was definitely super adaptive. Like I lived in this kind of I think a lot of like kids of immigrants, you kind of learn to code switch a lot. You learn like, okay, this is how I am with my family. And going to like an all white school, you kind of like learn how to adapt in that way. So I definitely grew up as someone who could like kind of maneuver through a lot of different circles. But I did live in this world of kind of extremes. Like when I started at my middle school, like I had a scholarship to go to like one of like the oldest, like most elite girls' schools in Canada. And so so in a weird way, I was sort of like embedded in this like 1%, but like definitely as an outsider, but kind of like this weird insider outsider. And then on the flip side, I had like the perspective of like my extended family who like went through a lot of like tough times, had a difficult time making ends meet. But I had friends at school who would like fly to St. Bart's for like a long weekend and stuff. And so it was really this like juxtaposition and this like vast array of seeing kind of different ends of the spectrum. So I was pretty adaptive and could move through a lot of circles. And I was super rebellious. I had a very strict Trinidadian mother, and I spent a lot of my time kind of like climbing out of windows, getting kicked out of the house, like moving in like to other places. So my adolescent years were actually pretty volatile, like being kind of out on my own, doing things, getting kicked out for going to the movies and stuff like that.
So I feel like your growing up sounds kind of like mine. I think my parents were not as strict, but I definitely was like super rebellious and like I snuck out and kind of like got chased by police and like all this kind of stuff. Were you like a really good student and then you hit your teenage years and then it was like rebellion and then like, is that kind of how it went?
Yeah. I was definitely like a kind of good girl. Like ticked all the boxes. Like there was such a big pressure on education, and I felt like the weight of everything my parents were kind of sacrificing for me. So whilst I was rebellious, I still really understood education as like a tool for social mobility, and that in many ways it felt like so much was being put into my education that whilst I was very rebellious, I still needed to kind of pass and stuff.
Where do you think that rebellion like came from all of a sudden?
Oh, I think it was just, living in Canada and living around, like most of my friends didn't have parents as strict. And so I was comparing my life and the things that people could do compared to, what my parents would allow me to do. And so they had come from very strict backgrounds, and to them they were very lenient. They were like, so I think it was just that comparison and seeing that, and ultimately, seeing that I wanted things to be different, and that I would stand up for kind of the things I believed in, which was that I should be allowed to go to the club, like, stuff like that.
I mean, this is jumping like way ahead, but do you think that colored kind of like, do you find a strand of that kind of throughout your life? Like, do you think that was like something that was like just a phase and like, okay, like that really wasn't kind of you, or do you find that kind of colored kind of your life going forward?
I definitely see that as a strand, like not necessarily that I'm like rebellious in the same way, but that like when there's a fork in the road, I have like a strong resilience to just doing something because it's what's expected. Like I will take that time to, and I'll choose the path that maybe isn't as easy, that maybe isn't as expected, but like that I really believe in, and as difficult and as challenging and as like scary as that sometimes can be. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I feel like your life has a lot of these kind of like choices that you made that like back up what you just said.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we're going to get into a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
What was your first job?
I had my first like unofficial job. So
Yeah.
I've always sort of been working from as long as I can remember. Like working was a very important kind of core value for my family. But I also felt from like a young age, like the freedom that can come with like earning money. And so, and that independence that can come from like having a bit of pocket money. So I mean, my earliest forms of earning money came from like babysitting. I had two younger brothers, and I ran like an absolute monopoly at their school with all the parents in their class. Like I just every single night of the week, I would have like somewhere I could babysit and like collect money. Pretty much from the age of like 12, people used to leave me like their kids for like a couple hours, and from like 12, 13, super young. Then like my first like salary-ish, well not salary, but like real job.
Yeah.
My parents can't swim, so they strategically made my brother and I lifeguards and swim instructors.
Just in case anything happens, you're definitely going to save them.
Yeah, exactly. And so in high school I worked as a lifeguard and a swim instructor. And then I also worked at like my first management experience was like the now defunct retail brand called American Apparel. And
Infamous.
Yeah. I started at them when I was like 16 years old, and they had just gone from being a wholesale company to a retail company. And I opened stores for them like all over the US and Canada. I hired teams, and I had to fire one of my friends. It was my first experience like at age 18 firing people, and it was horrible. I still, anytime I've had to fire people throughout my career, I've thought of that moment because it was so horrible.
Wait, okay. I have many questions.
Yeah.
One, how did you monopolize your school for babysitting? Like, what was your like growth strategy there? Like, how did you find parents who like needed babysitting?
Yeah, so I think it's also like anything, you have to have a great product and think about your referral. No, and so I would sometimes pick my brothers up from school. I would sort of build those relationships with the parents.
But you're not driving, right? So it's not like literally picking. You're just going to school.
No,
like
I'm just going to school. It was like down the street from my home, yeah. And I would meet parents, and I think also parents are relatively opportunistic. And in Canada, you don't really have like helpers the way you do in Southeast Asia. So people are like, "Hey, you don't look like a serial killer. Will you look after my kids?" So yeah, I think I just started with a couple of their friends, and then it grew from there. And then you would lock in sort of for the summer. You'd say you could kind of like tease the parents and be like, so-and-so's like been talking to me about going full time with them over the summer.
Wow. Playing parents against each other. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's funny. I mean, you basically just were like, who needs babysitters? Parents. Where are their parents? Schools.
Yeah.
Like by definition,
Yeah.
like go to schools, sell to schools.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
For the American Apparel, why are they having a 16-year-old like person open stores and hire people for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. but I was 16 when I started in the store. And then I had kind of like built that good rapport with, it was a pretty like small company at that time. And so people, when I had that summer off, like before I went to university, I was in the good books, and I think I just put my hand up. I saw that other people were like traveling and that they were opening all these stores, and I was like, I need to get away from Toronto, which at the time I thought was like, it was before Drake or anything. Like it was not a very cool city.
Drake changed everything. Drake changed everything.
And it was like, I need to get out of Toronto. And so this opportunity, I was like, they were opening something like, now in hindsight, like the blitz scaling of American Apparel, not a good shout. They were opening something like 15 stores in New York City in like one go, and like shutting them like 2 years later. But yeah, I was like, hey, I want to live in New York. I'll go. And
wait, so like, what's the actual story? Like, you're literally sitting in a meeting or something, and people are, I can't believe, when I was 16, I never sat in a meeting before, but you're like sitting in a meeting and they're like, hey, we want to open a bunch of these stores. And you just raise your hand. You're like, I'll go. And
yeah,
they're like,
I think there was
Yolanda.
This girl I knew who was like traveling with them, and she was like, now, especially if you know the reputation of American Apparel, you kind of, think of how seedy this is, but they essentially
Yep.
had apartments like all over like the US. They had apartments in like Miami and New York, and like they would just have like employees go and stay there and like work there, and they'd pay you from, which is totally illegal, but like
Mhm.
they'd pay you from like your home country payroll. And so I had heard this girl, and I was like, I want to do this. And I'm like, can you ask someone if I can do it too? And yeah, and I think I was a hard worker, and I mean, it was
They said
not, to be
yes.
honest, yeah, there wasn't like an interview process. I wish I was like, and I beat everyone out in the round. No, they were just like, okay, cool, get on a plane.
But to be honest, like I feel like a lot of opportunities are not interview processes,
Yeah.
right? It's just kind of like nobody even asked you.
Yeah.
It's just like I want to do that. Like you
Yeah.
just like tell somebody that you want to do something, right?
Yeah, exactly. And my parents were so freaked out, but I was like, I am an independent woman, and I'm going on a business trip. Like it was just like,
Yes. Wait. So you go home and you tell your very strict Trinidadian mom, and you're like, "I'm gonna." Did you wait? So you went to New York
yeah, I went to New York, and then I was in Miami as well.
for how long?
Like periods of like, I guess a couple months here and there. Yeah,
Wow.
it'd be like
So you're not going to school?
no, this was like over the summer. Yeah,
Oh, this is summer.
yeah.
Wow, summers in New York and Miami. So the best time of your life?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't have a fake ID, so
Okay.
it was tough in that respect. But it was amazing. It was so exhilarating, and I mean, they worked you like completely against any labor laws. You essentially had to work like 7 days a week for 14 hours, like folding T-shirts. Um, but it was super exciting for sure.
I feel for people who don't know the story of American Apparel, they should look it up. It's an interesting story, especially with the founder.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you know the story, I'm surprised American Apparel didn't hook you up with fake IDs. Is basically
Yeah.
how it goes. It's like
Yeah.
here's an apartment, here's a fake ID,
Yeah.
enjoy yourself. And then so that was during the summers of like high school.
That was my summer between high school and university.
Okay.
I had gotten to university in Canada for like 1 year and then left. And during that year, I still worked for American Apparel at their store, which was opening in the university town I was at. Um,
And what were you kind of thinking about? I mean, I'm going to ask the question that no teenager actually knows the answer to. It's like, what were you thinking at that time? Like, you're going to go into college. I'm sure. Did you know what you wanted to major in? Did you kind of know what you wanted to do?
Not at
Like,
all.
okay,
Not at all. I just knew I wanted to, like, I was optimizing for freedom. I think I thought like did 1 year of university at this place called Queen's University, which is like this very preppy university in Canada. My brother had gone there. He was 1 year older than me. And I kind of thought it was like, this is what I need to be somewhere very boring. And I always described Queen's University as like the university you see when you watch American movies about university. Like there was like frat guys and sorority girls, and anyone who knows me is like, I'm a city person through and through,
totally.
and it was this like, it was just not a fit for me. But I think at that time there was an image of like what I thought I should be, and I thought Queens would make me more into that person. Like who was going to like go to business school, or like I don't know what I thought it was, but it seemed like this is the decision I should take because this is what's expected of me.
Where do you think those I mean, it sounds like it probably came from your mother, but like, where do you think those kind of expectations on like what you should be came from?
A lot of it sort of came from my parents. I think my parents as well, like just, their understanding. I think as immigrants, like you're just optimizing for stability. And
Yeah.
so for them, like their understanding of stability is like, you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or like work in finance. And then also the school I went to was quite conservative like that as well. And so it's a classic example of like, you can only really be what you see. And so I thought like, okay, if I'm going to like be successful, these are the only paths that I can take, and this is going to take me there. And as much as I don't necessarily think that's a fit, I'm going to kind of go down that path. Yeah.
I've kind of been updating my view on the immigrant thing. I mean, we were both kind of like immigrants, and the whole stability thing, I definitely thought was like, okay, this is an immigrant thing. We want stability. But having spent more time in Southeast Asia and being from Southeast Asia, I think it's also like if you're from countries that are maybe like recently developed, stability is still a thing, right? So like I think in Singapore, and I mean, I'm from Malaysia, it's like families there, they're not immigrants, they're like from there, but
Yeah.
it's like stability is still the thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's you still, yeah. And I think the changes that people in a place like Singapore have seen in their lifetime, or, of my parents' generation, will be sort of similar. And you're just trying to like optimize for that. That makes sense.
So you went to, okay, so you were like, you went to school and then you were going to college. You're just kind of like, I guess, there because you thought you were
Yeah.
supposed to be there. And then what happened after that?
Oh, so I came back to the city. I was like, Mom and Dad, I want to be an artist. Which, if you, even though my parents are from the Caribbean, they're still ultimately very Asian. They were like, you what? Like, no, absolutely not. I was like,
That is like Asian parents' like worst nightmare. It's like you want to be wait, sorry, I just put you to college and you're
yeah,
an artist.
exactly. It was like, I want to go to art school. It's not for me. I don't like this place. And I want to go to art school, and being this is like one of these defining moments in my life, really, where my mother essentially was like, if you don't go back to university,
Wow.
you cannot move back into our house, essentially,
Wow.
for the summer. Which I was like, okay, challenge accepted. Which, again, not fully understanding what it takes to like live independently. I was like, I have a job at American Apparel, Mom. I'm moving out. Like, not understanding like how much rent is and how much like living as an adult is, but I did it. And I moved out into a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 friends. So we sort of rotated. We had 2 bedrooms and 3 people living there. And that is honestly like, that summer was one of my defining moments. So I decided I was like not going to go back. In my head, I knew I wanted to go to university, but I knew I wanted to do it on my own terms and kind of explore what I wanted to do. And so that summer, my friends and we had thought that, okay, we can build, like, we had seen this movie about Andy Warhol's like factory, and which now sounds obscene now that I'm like 33, looking back and being like, and we thought we could build like an Andy Warhol factory. And in Toronto in those days, real estate wasn't as expensive, and you could rent these like crazy, like quite disgusting industrial spaces, but kind of live in them as well. And we thought we could turn it into like an art production, like gallery, factory, whatever. And none of us like actually, I think the oldest adult in the room was like 23. And none of us like knew how the business model of like an art gallery works or anything like that. So we started to realize like, oh shit, how are we gonna, I was still working at American Apparel, but we were like, how are we gonna pay rent? And so we had this very big space and we sort of started, it happened really organically, but we thought that like nightlife in Toronto was like not as cool as New York. It was when kind of electronic music was like starting to kind of take off, and these people from Europe would like come over and they'd play in New York, and we would message these people on MySpace and say, do you want to play a show in Toronto? Or sometimes they'd be booked for a show and we'd say like, do you want to play an after party? Which was again completely illegal because there's a 2 a.m. kind of last call for alcohol, and we bought a vending machine off of Craigslist and stuffed it with beer, and we thought that got around like the selling alcohol thing. And so we started to throw these parties, and you could hold like 300 people there. And we kind of became this like mini like booking agency, and now like some acts that are quite big played at this space that we called Our Space because of MySpace, and it was like Our Space. And people like Major Lazer, like LCD Sound System, we had Daft Punk play there. Like we did some like pretty massive shows in the early days of this kind of scene taking off in Toronto, and it was called ADD, and we then started to do like some big brand partnerships, which none of us like understood how to do. I remember at the time doing something with Red Bull, and then not like thinking we got so much money, and now I'm like, oh my god, they fleeced us. They fleeced us. And we worked on like the kind of a consultant for this this guy named Peter Gation, who had like opened up a bunch of nightclubs in the 90s in New York, these really famous ones called like Limelight Tunnel. He was Canadian. He was opening something in Toronto, and we were kind of like brought in as these like young like kids who could kind of create this this nightlife there. And so ADD was sort of this like booking agency, this events company, this kind of promoter. And that's really how I got involved in the music industry. So I knew all of these artists, and from there, like one of them had kind of that we'd booked for a couple of shows. Like they were like, hey, this is probably when I'm 19. They said, hey, we had someone like quit. Do you want to come on tour with us as a production assistant? And so that's when I started. Technically, I was hired by ITB, which International Talent Booking, which is like one of the biggest artist booking agencies in the world. But I did work directly for an act called Soul Acts and Too Many DJs. They had 2 acts, but I toured with them all over the world at the age of 19. We did Coachella, we did Glastonbury, Fuji Rocks, like
Wow.
you name it. Like I spent a year of my life, which probably shaved like a few years off of my life, but on the road with like 14 dudes, like doing like techno productions around the world, and it was incredible. Like in many ways, like I learned so much about like thinking on your feet, because essentially like my job was you sign these like technical writers and artist writers, like which are essentially like a list of things you need when you arrive. You're contractually bound to. And my job was like sometimes we'd land that morning and have a show that evening, and like just to make sure like all of that stuff was there. And then sometimes, that works really well in markets like the US and the UK where people will follow that. But like sometimes you'd land in like Mexico City or Guadalajara and be like, wait, you guys have none of the stuff you need, and you're sort of running around the city trying to get everything in order.
There's a famous story, I'm sure you've heard of it, where I forget which band it was, but basically they wrote into their contract that they only want red M&Ms in their dressing room, and that was their way of seeing if the people actually like read their like terms. And I always thought that was very clever.
Promoters will do super sneaky stuff, because you'll be like, we need 7 bottles of champagne, and they'll buy like the mini champagnes. Like so skeezy.
So I feel like, I mean, that's an incredible story, and it's like, what an experience to have when you're like 19. But it's also unique. I mean, you were an entrepreneur at basically like that age, right? I mean, that whole thing you started is like, sure, it's not like a tech startup, but like that's entrepreneurship by any definition.
Yeah.
And you had no idea what you're doing, right? I mean,
no, definitely not. We were just trying to pay rent.
Right. And I feel like, a lot of people who want to start startups now, they often get this paralysis where it's like, oh, I just don't know how to do that. Or like, I don't know how this works. And like, so they never get started. And you and your friends kind of like didn't let any of that stop you. Right. Like, what do you think it was? I mean, and look, some part of it is probably being young and that kind of stuff, but like, you clearly just figured it out along the way. And you're like, why are you messaging Major Lazer on MySpace and being like, hey, you should come play this thing? Like who does that?
You know we didn't have money for a hotel. He was like, he was Diplo in those days, but but
you know what I mean, right? It's like
I think,
the audacity, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of this like, it's one part idealism, I think, where it's like having this vision for how things should be. And like, it's not necessarily like, maybe it was superficial in the sense like we just thought nightlife in Toronto should be cooler, and that was like something that we rallied around. I will definitely not discount the fact that there was like, oh shit, we need to like pay rent. Like I've never been poorer than I was at that time of my life. I remember having less than $20 in my account and not being able to like take out that $19 because the minimum withdrawal in like Canadian banks is like $19. And so there was definitely that element of like, okay, we just need to figure it out so that we can like eat. And and there is, I guess, like a bit of there is like a sort of young flippancy or arrogance. I don't know what you'd call it, where it's like, I'm just going to figure this out. Like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I accept that, but like, yeah, I'm still going to go for it. And maybe it's not going to work, but then we're going to try something else. And then we're going to host weddings or something. I don't know, in the space. Yeah. That was sort of the attitude, but it's only but then I say it like, at the time we didn't necessarily like think about it. It was like, hey, this is a cool thing we want to do. Let's try it. It wasn't necessarily like overthinking it. Like, I think you've got to underthink sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, we had it's one thing that I've been thinking, I have thought a lot about over the years is like, how do you keep that level of kind of optimism and almost naiveness even as you get older, right? Like we got started doing startups because we had no idea what we were doing. So the story I always tell is you can't be afraid of the dragon in the cave if you don't know that there's a dragon or you don't know that the dragon will eat you. Like you're just like, cool, there's a cave. Like, let's go in the cave, right? And when you're young, you just don't know anything about the dragon, right? So you're just like, cool, let's go. But as you get older, like you learn all about all these things and primarily learn about why things don't work. And so I don't know. That's something that, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about, but it's like, that's something I think about a lot of like, how do you fight some of that as you get older?
Yeah. I'm still learning that. Like, because I think that feeling doesn't necessarily go away. Like, I think you just learn to sit with that discomfort better. Like, I think you're constantly like pushing yourself, and you'll hear, I'm sure, as you hear my story, like you're kind of constantly putting yourself in scenarios that make you uncomfortable, but like that's ultimately how you learn and how you grow. And so you've got to kind of learn to like sit with that fear of the dragon. Otherwise, like you kind of don't ever find the treasure in the cave.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like you almost never as confident as you were when you were like 19, even though you know so much more, right?
That's so true.
And I don't know, it's a funny thing. Okay, so you went on tour for a year, and you obviously were not going to college, right? So you did like a year of college. You're like, I'm leaving home.
Yeah.
You're like on tour, and like, you eventually kind of like stopped in the music. You stopped kind of being part of the music industry. Like, what happened? Did you just kind of like get burned out of being on tour, where you're like, I got to do something else?
Yeah, I think a few things happened. Like, I think the freedom that I was so craving for so long, I got it like in the.
You got all of it. You got all of it.
I did all the things, and so I was like, okay, I'm done. There was that element. There was also like it stopped being interesting and challenging. It's the same production pretty much every night, and it started to be just like, whether you were in Tokyo or Dallas or like, Chile, you wouldn't really care. It was the same show. And so I think once that I stopped thinking,
Yolanda, your life sounds so cool. You're like, whether you're in Tokyo or Chile or Dallas, it's all the same. And I'm like, wow, that's your life is so cool.
But the thing is, like, you would only be in these places for like 48 hours max. And so there was that. And then there was just like, I think it gave me that headspace to like think about, okay, what do I want to be doing? What's important to me? And I realized how important I think having an impact was. And I think I was then finally kind of ready to go back to university. Like I felt like then I was just really I was interested. I had seen the world. I was interested in kind of like making that better somehow. I know it sounds like very altruistic, but that is generally what motivated me. I kind of felt like I was in this place where I looked around at the people who were like more senior, and I didn't necessarily want to be them. And so I thought it was like a really fun kind of gap year, and started getting ready to go back to university. And I always had like a very clear picture in my head that I wanted to like work in emerging markets. Like that was, I don't know what it was. I think it was like, maybe I saw a little bit of it when I was on tour. It was also my parents were from emerging markets. I've always kind of had this like fascination that like, this is where the change is going to come. And this is where there's like more interesting problems to solve. And So I studied like international development. Like I thought I was going to work at like the United Nations. I almost came full circle. I was like, I need to repent for my years in the music industry. So I'm gonna go and like save the world and work for like the United Nations or the World Bank or something like that. And so that was really the trajectory I was on. I interned at the UN. I worked at the European Court of Human Rights. I was like, I am now like the ultimate. I was valedictorian of my undergraduate class. I graduated top of my class at Oxford.
Queens?
No. Then I
So
moved.
you switch?
Yeah. So I was like, I'm not moving back to Canada. I had I had spent a lot of time like in Brussels, and I thought like, oh, I was really fascinated by the European Union because I was interested um, in this like kind of moving beyond like nationalism, which at the time seemed like in my head like, oh, this is like going to die and we're going to get rid of borders, and it was like this, now that,
Yeah.
but in those like mid 2000s, it was sort of like, oh, this is like we're moving to this kind of multilateralism, and I wanted to improve my French. I speak French as well, and so I moved to Brussels, and I was kind of studying there. And I liked it because it gave me this sort of access to a lot of a lot of the organizations I wanted to be working at that time, and getting that exposure, which I think ultimately kind of helped me because I think having those experiences and those exposures, sometimes when you're in university, you have these ideals of like what it's going to be like to work in these spaces, and getting those tastes like throughout university helped me to realize like, maybe this isn't quite where I want to be. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I feel like there's two parts of that kind of really resonates. One is that, and I've heard you say this before, since we've talked a bunch of times, but if you're ever at a place where you're looking at the people that are more senior than you and you don't want to be them, you're like, I don't know if I should be here, right?
yeah,
Like that's like a telltale sign of like you should
definitely.
rethink,
Yeah,
right? Um, but it's an interesting kind of like change because you literally get off tour and then you move to like Brussels and you like start going to school. And like you said, you were like very successful at school. You were like valedictorian. You
yeah,
went to Oxford,
yeah.
right? And like,
Yeah. I won a prize
like,
at Oxford. And like, which everyone in my class was like so disappointed because I just did things like, I'm never the student who works like the most hours, but I work in a very
oh,
smart way. I
I hate you.
like, I'm just like, this isn't on the exam, so I'm not going to show up. like, and yeah, and so but I think honestly, my experience of I think that the diversity of my experience, whether it's like
Yeah.
working in the music industry or moving to that ultimately helped me to, and still to this day, like helps me to see.
Yeah.
I'm very good at like taking systems from completely different like places and applying them in other places, and like thinking about problems in really different ways. And like I did win a prize at Oxford for like my dissertation, and that was the feedback they got. They were like, you completely went like out to left field and took this completely different like theoretical framework or whatever and applied it to something like to a completely different discipline. And that is like a theme I think in my life, is like I attack problems through kind of a different way. Yeah.
And I just elaborating on that, that to you comes from you having just like a wide range of experiences.
Yeah, I think it comes down also to like the core of who I am in many ways, like being able to always kind of like I've always like straddled multiple worlds, and I think like that's a big part of my identity that like maybe was a bit hard in the beginning, but now I think I'm okay like kind of being in like multiple boxes. And even in like living in Singapore, people, it's like, yeah, I am like kind of Chindian, but like also Caribbean, but also Canadian, but and you kind of just learn like yeah, through having those layers of identity, you kind of can blend and see things from different perspectives.
I think the code switching part is like very kind of like comes through too,
Yeah.
like context kind of. So what did you? Okay, so you went from touring in school or touring for a year, and then being really good student And then, so, you graduated, you went from Brussels, then you studied at Oxford, and then you graduated from Oxford. And I mean, you're kind of like on top of the world a little bit, right? You went to this like very good school, you kind of like won this award, and I'm sure you could have done a lot of things. What did you end up deciding to do?
Yeah. So after that, I'd been like explore. I actually didn't necessarily like know what I wanted to do, as many graduates, as many graduates don't. Um, but I was exploring a lot of options, and there was definitely this again, like this like side of me that was like, maybe you should become a management consultant. And so many people were like going down those paths, and what did I? My story was okay. I had done some of my research for my master's in Kenya, and I had spent some time on the ground and seen like I thought I wanted to go and work in like the World Bank, and then when I was on the ground, I realized that they're not necessarily like moving the needle or like having a measurable impact in the way that I thought I had ideally hoped. But what I did see while I was in Kenya was how incredible and the impact that technology could have. And so, for those of you that maybe don't know, that Kenya has this incredible system of mobile payments called M-Pesa, which is one of the most successful systems of mobile payments. You can pay with like a non-smartphone literally anywhere in the country.
Wow.
And you can pay on like a Nokia 200 from like the 90s, and pay for things like in rural Kenya. It has something like 89% penetration.
Wow.
So, so that was incredible to see how technology transformed lives, because you saw people from like who were like storing money under their mattress and to go to storing money in M-Pesa and being able to kind of amass savings for the first time. And I just thought I'd never seen anything like this in my life, particularly in a market like Kenya. And so then, I had a friend who was working for Rocket Internet at that time. She was a childhood friend from Canada, and she was like, "Hey, Rocket is doing a massive expansion. Maybe you should think about coming here." And I was, interviewing for the consulting firms and for these like big entry level roles at these big like organizations like the World Bank and UN, but they were kind of like internships, like because you have to really start in the ground. You have to start in like the ground floor at those places, and so I like when I got the Rocket offer, I was like, okay, like what, you want me to like have all of this responsibility, and that was really exciting to me. Like it really was the amount of experience and responsibility that they were willing to give like a 20-something-year-old who had like literally never managed a budget before in her life, like was crazy. And so that I couldn't turn down. Like when I compared that to like, okay, these very straightforward like consulting roles or things like that, like I really looked at like my propensity for growth, and my propensity for growth was so massive. So from there, I joined Rocket Internet and got on that ride. And so their big Africa HQ they were building out in the beginning was in Nigeria, and that was sort of the big hub. And they were setting up essentially like a business is now called Jumia, but it was Amazon of Africa, and it is Amazon of Africa. It is, and so my initial job was kind of like helping to kind of get that off the ground. It was sort of my test role, and being kind of a jack of all trades, and kind of helping to launch that, whether it's like looking at warehouses or signing up sellers or like training drivers, or like it was just like chaos like absolute chaos. It was, I mean, working in West Africa, like I think is where I really came of age as a leader. Like, I think it was really a baptism by fire. Like, it was, I think I went there as like a nice Canadian girl. And I left as like a really tough businesswoman. And it was, it was really tough. It was really tough in the sense of like, I was not used to that many friction points. Like, just in your day-to-day life, like opening a bank account will take you 9 months. Just basics, like the level of market education, because you're not just first mover in your vertical. So I then went on to like launch and manage their food vertical for Jumia, which was food delivery. So similar to, it was essentially Food Panda. It was the same company in those days, but it was called Hello Food in that region. And it was, you have to think like the level, you always need to do like a degree of market education with a new product. But in West Africa in particular, you're like the first online business that someone is interacting with. And so learning to build that trust, not just like trust in your brand, but like trust in like ordering things online is a lot of market education. And that goes like, because we were building marketplace models, it was really about building trust across all aspects of the marketplace. So getting restaurants to trust you, getting riders to trust you, and getting customers to trust you. So,
How did you think about like, I mean, I feel like you just like went in your story. I feel like in your head, you're just like, oh yeah, I went to Africa. But I feel like for most people, like that's kind of a big decision. But to you, it almost was kind of like, it seems more exciting the way you talk about it.
Yeah. It wasn't like, I mean, it was so fast, partially because Rocket Internet were like, we need you here next week. So it was so fast. Like I didn't honestly have that much time to mull it over. And I think like when I really believe in like being a yes woman, a yes person. And so it was the opportunity to get on this rocket ship in some ways, but it was really like starting off in the continent. And so it was this ability to be part of something. And if I hated it, I could always leave. So I didn't really like think it through that much. And I am so sort of attracted to places where and Africa as a region is like somewhere that people have so many preconceived notions about. And I was so intrigued to really become like, to gain that firsthand experience in a place where people have so many ideas about, and particularly in building like a tech company, like Africa's probably like the part of the world you think the least about. And so there was this element of like, okay, I want to be a part of that. I want to be part of like the first e-commerce company on the continent. And that's like something I can always say I was part of. And it was an incredible experience kind of to set it up. It wasn't without its challenges though. Like I used to call my parents crying. Definitely.
I'm sure they're very worried about you too.
Like, yes and no. Like weirdly, I just don't know if they like naively didn't realize how crazy it was. Like they were sort of like, oh, cool, like have fun. Like,
have fun.
Have fun. Yeah.
I mean, I guess you toured for a year, so it's kind of like, this seems like Yolanda doing Yolanda things. So.
Yeah. I think they were more concerned about that, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to fast forward a ton.
Okay.
So I mean, just to give people quick things, like you were in Africa for a while, then you've been in Singapore for like a couple of years, right? You were with Deliveroo here for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And then you're working on a new startup now called Uncommon. Do you want to talk to people kind of like what that is real quickly?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to share more about Uncommon. So Uncommon is a new kind of invite-only professional community for women in Southeast Asia. When I was in lockdown, so like it kind of has been an idea I've been working on for a while in different iterations, but when I was in lockdown, I interviewed over 100 women in Singapore. And I noticed like some fundamental patterns that started to come up. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, the women in this group that I interviewed, they rated the quality of their professional network at about a 4. And when I looked at like
Wow.
and then when I asked them like, okay, what is what do they rank the importance of having like a strong network in their career? They ranked it a 9. So that was like a pretty big disconnect. It's like, okay,
That's a huge delta.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I dug into this, like, and when I like was interviewing these women, like I realized like a lot of the tools that exist for like building a network are fundamentally designed for men and not necessarily in the ways in which women want to connect, which is through shared experience, through building relationships rather than something really transactional. And so that was sort of like the thesis initially. And that thesis was somewhat validated by I've been like in the women's space, if you can call it that, like for a long time. I had kind of been like hosting. Uncommon actually started as a dinner, and I would like host a monthly dinner that was sort of word of mouth for about like 8 to 12 women. And it would be on like a broad, but like a kind of shared experience subject. So it could be something like confidence, or it could be jealousy, or and that was sort of like how we started to build this community. And then so when I say I was like in the women's space, like I've been on every diversity committee, the good, the bad, the ugly, at every company I've been at. I've been, and actually at Deliveroo, I set up like our gender diversity task force and all of, and so it was like pretty, even though it wasn't my core role, I was invested in the space. I was getting to understand the problem. I felt like I spent a lot of my career like kind of testing out what I thought was missing in the space, because I knew I was kind of like circling around it. So Uncommon, like we essentially offer like a suite of services to women, and hopefully that will be something that can be personalized. So it's everything from peer coaching, exec coaching. We run programs. We have speaker series and workshops. And the idea is that we can develop women according to their own kind of personalized goals. But in achieving their personalized goals, we can, it's like achieving your personalized goals, but together, and you kind of realize that shared experience. It's like, even though it's individual, you kind of keep each other accountable and supportive through that community.
And did you, like, you were talking about, you were like in the like women's like space, and like obviously you're a woman, so you like care, but like what drew you more to kind of do something about it? Was it like personal experiences that you had, and kind of like probably being in a lot of room with like a lot of dudes and like not kind of seeing a lot of people like you? Like what was, I mean, I think a lot of people have felt probably kind of like what you felt, but there's something, I mean, you're kind of doing something about it. Like, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I think it's like a long arc, to be honest. Like I think I had, these moments throughout my career which were challenging, and I didn't necessarily like have that support. And I honestly, I think part of it was like, I just got tired about talking about this in the back channels with my female leader friends. And I was like, this shouldn't be like solely bilateral conversations. So that was part of it. But I also remember like a big moment for me was at like one of my first roles, and I found out like someone who was actually like managing a smaller business than me was paid 30% more than me and I remember like the day I found that out and how horrible I felt, and just that I was like told that, there was no room in the budget, and this and that was like that was like a start of something. But there was also, coming back to this idea of like code switching. Like I grew up with 3 brothers, and so I do have like an ability to turn up like my broiness, and it has served me. It's a bit sad that I've had to do that. But
that's why I'm laughing.
It's a bit sad I've had to do that, but I had like not necessarily like consciously, but I knew that I could like get ahead in many ways, like, and I could build that like connection with like the people that I needed to, like, by being kind of like outbroing all the bros, like, and maybe this is like my time in the music industry, which like helped to kind of pad that, but that was like a big part of it. But I saw like particularly women who like didn't necessarily, that's not for everyone, and like every woman shouldn't like have to like, you know, chug all the like beers or whatever, like stuff like that. Like that shouldn't be like a prerequisite. And so there was that element of it. And then it was also like, you know, there's like the big pieces there. I think people think of like women in the workplace, and the big piece is like sexual harassment. Like that is definitely there, and that is definitely a problem. But it's the day-to-day that like keeps, that stops women from getting ahead. Like I've been on like hiring panels, particularly like, which I don't understand like how someone thought this was okay to say, but I've been on hiring panels where we interviewed like an incredible female candidate and was like, I don't know if like we should take her on because, you know, she's moving to the city and her husband's here and she's probably going to want to start a family. Like the level of like mental gymnastics that you have to do to not want to take on a candidate. But like the level of mental gymnastics to like come to that conclusion was just crazy to me. And there's like so many.
That's illegal in the United States, right?
Yeah.
I think that's illegal.
Oh, for sure. And even like, I mean, that is illegal in a lot of countries.
Not that stops people from saying it, to be fair. For
sure. And it's in like much more subtle ways that it shows up. And it's like I always had to like walk the line between, you know, this is such a common trope, but it is so real, where like you are too aggressive and you're not assertive enough at the same time. Like you are damned if you do. And like I would often get that feedback. I got it on the same performance review once, like you are too aggressive and you put people off in the office, and then like 3 comments down, but you really need to speak up more. It was like
you're like, which one is it?
Yeah, exactly. Like I just don't know how to even like implement that feedback. And so so that was, that was definitely an element of it, as well as like seeing, I think like once I started to have this heightened awareness was, you know, thinking of, okay, because a big part of being like a female leader is figuring out, coming back to that bit about discomfort, is like you've got to build the discomfort, be comfortable with the discomfort of standing in the gap. And because you've got to get comfortable like being in rooms where no one looks like you, where no one's going to see your viewpoint, where no one's going to validate like your views. And there's this like resilience, this ironclad resilience that you have to build up, but it's so hard to do it alone. It's so, and I do think that so much value can come from having that shared experience and realizing that you're not, you know, and I think you were the one who actually told me this term, but like that you're not an island. Like, I think that's one thing I realized is like so many female leaders like feel like an island, and they don't realize that like everyone else is kind of feeling like that as well.
Yeah. And I feel, I mean, I'm a dude, so I don't see a lot of this, but like I have quite a few female friends, and you know, your private chat groups with other female, like I see that all over the place. Like everybody I know is on like some chat group with that, right? And it's always on the down low, and it's never kind of like, you know, and so I totally kind of like see those kind of around. And I think the other part that is tricky, you know, some of the conversations that I've had with friends who are women and they're especially founders, is they have this moral struggle between whether they get good at playing the game, like the broy game, or not, right? And like some are kind of willing to do it and they're okay with that, and some people are like, I don't feel like I should have to, and so I don't want to, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you kind of, where do you land on that? It's like, I was like, when I think about that, I'm like, I have no idea where I would land on that. Like, that's such a tough place to be. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't know. I think it's like different for each person, I guess. It's kind of you're damned if you do, damned if you
Yeah.
don't. Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess the other part of it too is that, I mean, we do not have enough time to get into like all of the systematic reasons why the world is the way that
Yeah.
it is. But whenever I think about this particular problem, it feels like it's not going to be solved. And look, you know this much better than me, so
Yeah.
correct me. But my view is, it seems like it's not going to get solved overnight, and there's no simple answers here, right? Like,
Yeah.
not everybody is all of a sudden going to become empathetic, and we're
Yeah.
all just going to be like kumbaya. Like, there's no way, right? And so I guess maybe as a place to kind of start, like, how do you? I guess there's two parts, right? There's going to be women who listen to this, and like, how do they kind of help themselves and kind of be part of the solution and that kind of stuff. Maybe there's another part too. It's like, for all the men that are listening to this, and me included, like, how do they kind of like help, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's certainly, this is not going to get solved by a bunch of men sitting on the side being like, oh, this is a problem for you, so you all,
For sure.
you all figure this out. Like, it's not going to work, right? So I don't know. How do you kind of think about that for kind of the different genders?
Yeah, I would say for women, like, and this is just speaking from my experience, but I would say, it's really important to kind of have a supportive crew. Like, and it doesn't just have to be women, but like people that and this is something like we did with our members at Uncommon, is like coming up with like, who is the person who's going to like be your kind of everyday person, like who maybe keeps you like kind of motivated? Who's your person who's going to give it to you, that straight talk when you really need it? Who's the person, who'll give you those technical skills that you need in your domain? And like building this sort of like personal like advisory board, and like keeping a regularity to that like cadence, and these people that are going to like push you and keep you accountable. And this is kind of something we've tried to do at Uncommon, is like, how can we kind of build these like, because it isn't necessarily about like knowing everybody in the city. It's like, how can you build your core to be really strong, and then when you do interact with like everyone out there, you've got this kind of strong core to come back to. That would be that I think is really, really important for women.
Do you feel like you have that, like, personally? Like, did you have that kind of just like at some point in your career now? Do you feel like you have that?
Yeah, I think I've learned to build that. Like, I think there's times, like particularly earlier in my career, like I did not have that. And like, probably part of the reason why I was like paid 30% less. Like someone would have told me like, hey, you should push back on this, or and so yeah, now I do. Now but it's something like you have to cultivate. But like a lot of women have told me, like, I don't even know where to find these people,
Yeah.
And so that's what we're kind of trying to do with Uncommon, is like, how can we create this and save people the time? Like, what are you going to do? Like, go and hunt people down on LinkedIn? Like, my LinkedIn's just filled with spam. Like even if someone did reach out to me, I wouldn't even see it. And so being able to kind of like build, yeah, I have been able to build that, but it's only been in, I'd say, like the last 3 years I've been intentional about doing that. Yeah.
And I maybe that's the trick too. It's like, you have to be kind of intentional about it. Otherwise it's not going to kind of like happen, right? Like you're like, okay, I do need this stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but what about the men's side?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much. I'm so happy you asked this question, because I completely agree that like men are such a crucial part of this, and the majority of men I speak to, like, they want to help, and so I don't like by any means think that the majority of men like don't want to help in some way, and don't acknowledge that this is a problem. I would say like it's really simple, but starting with listening. Like a lot of the frustrations I hear when I speak with women is like that they're just not listened to, that their experience, because it might be different from, what's reflected in, the kind of wider body of people that they work with, or wider society. It's not necessarily shared these experiences, but that just listening can be a really great place to start, like listening and validating what women are going through. Like, that is that is revolutionary in and of itself. I would also say, a big piece of the puzzle is like having those difficult conversations and confrontations with other men. Like, the same thing can carry so much more weight and can land so much better than coming from a man, than coming from a woman. Than coming from a woman versus a man. Some of the times in my career when I have felt like the most let down have been when, like, male friends or male colleagues have seen something really horrible go on and just kind of not said anything. And so that having those difficult conversations, whether they're one-on-one, whether they're like in a meeting, calling, if a woman's like said something and someone kind of takes over or takes credit for it, like calling that out in a nice way, like that, just being that sort of person, because you're not, the reality is, like, there's less of a penalty when it comes from a man. Like, I think as a woman, you're constantly calculating, like, what's the penalty for me saying this? How am I going to get backlash for saying this? And the other thing is just taking, like, micro steps. Like, I think when I look at that, like, very small sample size of 100, like, okay, how can that sample size of 100 who think their network is a 4 out of 10, like, how can you pay it forward? Can you meet that woman for a coffee? Can you mentor someone? That those kind of small acts really, I think, dramatically can change people's careers.
I guess a couple of thoughts here. I can totally relate with the, like, when you're the person that's in the position of privilege, like standing up for the person who maybe is not. Because I think, growing up, I was a minority in the United States, and it's the same thing, right? It's like, it helped, at least in the United States, was majority kind of white. Like, I think white people kind of sticking up for minorities, like, helps, right? And I can totally identify with that. And I see it in Singapore too, because now I'm part of the majority, and that's a very weird feeling, but, like, it's the same thing, right? And, like, men kind of, like, are in a place, we don't lose points, as you kind of put it, right? So kind of stepping in those places kind of, like, helps. Is there anything we can do to help the listening part? And I mean, first of all, like, low bar is, like, our job is to, like, listen, like, men should be able to do that. But to be frank, we are not known for our ability to listen. So we can all do better there. But I think part of it too is, like, how do we signal that we are kind of, like, want to listen? Because I think sometimes maybe women are kind of jaded that, like, the world has kind of taught them that, like, men don't want to listen to it, or, like, that kind of stuff. And so is there something we can do to kind of, like, signal, ask questions to kind of be like, hey, like, this is, like, and look, I don't want to engage with someone if they don't want to engage with me. Like, my job is, their job is to not engage with me, right? But, like, almost kind of make it okay. Like, hey, if this is something you want to talk about, like, is there something we can kind of do there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, that it would be, I would say, like, probably bridging this, if you observe something, like, for me, the best times people have brought it up is, like, sometimes it's a bit exhausting as a woman, like, to constantly have to talk about, like, the challenges of, like, being a female leader. But I think if you observe something, like, building it around that context can often be like, hey, I observed this, like, just wanted to check if you're okay, or, like, what would be, like, a great way to support you in a situation like that, or and I think framing it in that way can really help. I think it depends also on, like, your level on your relationship with the person in a lot of ways. Like there's some people, I think, depending on their level of comfort, like, yeah, being that that person and that who will kind of listen and validate those experiences is really really important. But it can be hard with strangers or people you don't know, where there is that sort of barrier. And I think in a lot of ways, women can, I have definitely felt, and I think we can be socialized, like we should not complain, like we should be grateful for, like there's this sense of like, oh, I don't want to like look like I'm not happy or I'm not grateful for how far I've come. And so there's a little bit of like, oh, I don't know if this is like a safe enough space to express these things. So I think gauging that based on kind of your level of comfort with someone is important as well.
I think I think it's great advice to like put it within the context of something you noticed, right? Because I think sometimes, I mean, it's like you said, it's like it can be exhausting if like every guy is like, hey, talk to me about being a female founder or like a female, like it's just like, okay, like, like I have to live with this like all day. Now I got to educate you, like every dude that I run into. It's like, oh, great, right? But I think that it sounds like kind of if you notice some of those things and just even checking, because then they can opt in and out of it, seems like a good approach. They can be like, no, I'm okay. And take that as kind of like, look, let them kind of be. They don't,
Yeah. Another tactic is like to educate yourself and bring it in that in terms of that sort of framing, being like, I've had men be like, hey, I've read, Lean In. Tell me, does that like mirror your experience? And you're like, yeah, sort of in this way and not in this way. And you can build a talking point around that. Like, I think being a woman and a minority, like you often like sometimes get like hit on both ends, like your friends like wanting to explain. And so sometimes it's easier if someone's done like a little bit of legwork first, so you're not like starting from scratch.
Do you have recommendations on what that legwork is? I mean, should every guy just run out and like read Lean In?
Lean In's like a kind of business book, but there's a lot of like, I actually am a big fan of like reading fiction, because you can hear like experiences and stories. So it's less sort of like just exposing yourselves to different perspectives and being immersed in different worlds. Like I'm a big fan of fiction as well. So I can kind of send you some. But I really love the book Americana in terms of like framing.
I just got that.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of like framing like from a really different experiences and I love anything by Zadie Smith. Yeah, I'm sort of blanking at the moment on what I'm reading, but Girl, Woman, Other that just won the Man Booker Prize. Like that's a great way of kind of framing female experiences from the first person.
And actually to that point, this is embarrassing, but like most of the books I read, and I've read quite a lot of books, quite a lot of fiction, is male authors. And recently I read some books by female authors with a female like main character, and the way that women write women, like their internal dialogue is like totally different. It's so different. And I was like, oh, of course it's different.
And it's so interesting. And so that's why like, you can read sort of like tips and strategies, but I think like I really believe that like fiction helps to build empathy, and particularly fiction from experiences and viewpoints that are different from your own. So.
And maybe that's like a good place for us to kind of like end it, because I think at the end of the day, empathy is always the word that I know you and I talk about a lot, right? It's like at the end of the day, it's like I think the best way that men can help is to like empathize with the challenges that women come through. Do you feel like that's a fair thing to kind of?
Yeah. I think empathy is like a really good kind of starting point, definitely, and that it's like a prerequisite to then taking action. So.
If you don't empathize, you're not going to really you're just going to be doing the action because you were told to kind of do the action, right?
Yeah. I think if you're building something like your solid foundations for change, then empathy kind of needs to be a part of it.
Cool. Thanks, Yolanda. I appreciate your time on a Friday afternoon, to tell me your like life story and talk about
Yeah.
Uncommon.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.